And thanks for tuning in this afternoon to listen to what my PhD research is all about. I just wanted to say hi before I switch to my sharing screen mode, and just I call out to a couple of my PhD peers who are in the room today, and thanks for being there as a great support for me as usual. So I'm just going to share my screen. The topic of my conversation today is we've got Indigenous evaluation all wrong. And I'm really just going to talk you through the story of my PhD research. I'd like to start by just acknowledging the Yugambeh people of the Bundjalung Nation. That's where I'm calling in from today, but I'd also like to acknowledge all of the elders, past, present and emerging, on the countries that we're all gathered on, and just acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to say thank you to them for being such amazing custodians of the land that we're gathered on. So who am I, and who am I to be doing this research? My name is Nicole Tujague, and I'm a Kabi Kabi South Sea Island woman. That means that part of my heritage is the Kabi Kabi people from around the Noosa area, and also South Sea Islander from Goa Island in Vanuatu, where my great-grandfather was stolen as a slave to work the cane fields in North Queensland. He was one of the Kanakas. That photos of my little family, my mum holding my younger sister, and that's me and my brother, and we have another little sister who's not in that photo. So looking at the Indigenous Map of Australia, and these are all of the language groups in Australia, and this is how we as Aboriginal people still see Australia. And if we meet another Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, we always identify ourselves from the country that we belong to. And that little I am here icon is where the Kabi Kabi people in Southeast Queensland are. So what is evaluation? And I thought I'd start really basic with what is evaluation, in case there are people in the room who are experts in really different things and don't really know much about what evaluation is. But evaluation in its simplest form is something that we do every day. If we get up in the morning and we go to make some scrambled eggs, for instance, we get to the end of the process, we sit down to eat, and then we figure out, okay, did I remember everything in the recipe, and does it taste okay? And what we're actually doing is we're evaluating our process, our implementation, and then how it turned out. So evaluating is really just working out if something was successful and met all the outcomes that we wanted it to, or not, and if not, why. That's the pretty simple explanation of evaluation. So as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we've been using sophisticated methods of evaluation for over 50,000 years. That's one of the reasons why we have survived. So it's not a new concept. However, in Western knowledge systems or in Western society, evaluation has become a really specialized way of working, and in fact it's now called a discipline. So there are loads of people who are experts in all these really different ways of evaluating. So if you were evaluating if you put everything you needed to into the scrambled eggs that you were cooking, that's a different type of evaluation to if you're the person sitting down and going, okay, does this taste good? So over the years, evaluations developed into all of these streams of really specialized methods and processes. And this knowledge tree sort of helps you see some of the main names and the key players in the Western evaluation world. The red blotches are actually, when I was doing my literature review, they're actually the specific Indigenous evaluation methodologies that I could find. So there were basically three. One in Africa, the African peer-reviewed mechanism, systemization in Latin America methodology, and in India, so you can see there's not a big Indigenous voice in the evaluation world, even though we have been doing it as collective communities for many years. I based my PhD research on a couple of theories just to keep me grounded and focused. The first one is complex adaptive systems theory. And that's a theory that just acknowledges that the world is a complex place, that it's very hard to plan a linear process and not have changes happen along the way. And that applies specifically in Indigenous communities. So it's, for an example, if you have a flock of birds that are flying, and a gust of wind comes along, it'll change the formation of the flock of birds. If hot air current rises, it might change the formation. And so that flock of birds, it has a formation, but it's constantly changing according to the environment. And that is exactly what happens in communities. And of course, that affects our evaluation processes. The other theory that I've used to base my research on is Indigenous standpoint theory. And all that's saying is I'm looking at it as an Indigenous person through the world view and lens of an Indigenous person. And I'm really going to privilege Indigenous voices in all of my research and all of my methodology. When I get to the thematic analysis, I've also used a specific Indigenous methodology for my thematic analysis, which I thought would be interesting just to mention now. It's Younger Porter's Indigenous thematic analysis. It's grounded in Aboriginal protocols of communal knowledge production. So that whole not producing knowledge on your own, but as a collective. It's based on ancient oral cultural practice and on the contemporary thought experiment or ritual. And what that means is, when I got all my data together, I do this amazing big visual with all the moving parts in it, all the relationships, and myself in that visual, and that's how I do my thematic analysis. So when I looked at the literature, I looked for what was missing, because that's what we do our PhD research on, right? So what I found was there was very little Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander voice in the evaluation space. So I decided to go out and ask, what do Aboriginal people think is important when evaluating projects and programs that affect them? So that's my evaluation question. So why is this even important? I think a really good story is one that's written about in Sarah Hudson's 2016 Centre for Independent Studies research report. She talks about a government spend of $672 million in the first 15 months of a strategic Indigenous housing and infrastructure program in the Northern Territory, during which time not one house was built. So basically, the government spent $672 million over a 15-month period in a program to build houses for Northern Territorians. But in that 15 months and after $672 billion, not one house was built. So it just, I guess, brings home the importance of hearing the values and what's important for the end user. So I think if we asked the Northern Territorians if that was a successful 15 months, the ones that were waiting for a house, perhaps they wouldn't have evaluated that as particularly successful. So every year about $5.9 billion is spent on Indigenous programs. And this is not just government programs that affect everyone, but also affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This is specific Indigenous programs. We know that less than 10% of those programs are evaluated. And we know that most of that evaluation is done through a Western lens. So we're asking non-Indigenous people what's important to measure and how we should be measuring it. Sort of doesn't make sense, hey? So why is this important? And I'm not going to put a whole lot of statistics out there, because we all hear constantly the negative rhetoric of how bad Indigenous health is. All I'm going to say is that today, 1/3 of Indigenous Australians still live in poverty. So getting our evaluation processes right is a really important key into making sure that the right programs are refunded and that we can learn from what we're doing that's not producing outcomes. So I decided to go and talk to a group of people who I'm already working with in a private practice, and that's the Kinchela boys, who were the survivors of the Kinchela boys home in Kempsey. And I went to ask them what they think was important to measure around a program that they've written. So the Kinchela boys home was, as I said, I don't want to say an orphanage, but it was a house, a home in Kempsey where children were taken from the 1920s through to the 1960s. And during that time, children were kidnapped, and the men liked to use that word kidnapped, from as young as 6 weeks old. They had their identities removed from them, their clothes burnt, all of their identification burnt. They were given numbers instead of their names. So to this day, they still call each other by their numbers when we're in meetings and things. So my plan so far is on this timeline, and you can see the Where Am I icon there. I've just finished transcribing and the thematic analysis, and I'm sort of now in the process of writing up what I've found. So what I'll be able to share with you today is just some of those really initial findings. So when I went to the Kinchela Boys Home Aboriginal Corporation, which is located in Redfern in Sydney, I spoke to the uncles, which are the ones that you see holding their numbers. I spoke to their descendants, which is the photo in the middle, and I spoke to the staff at KBHAC, and I asked all of them, what do they think is important to measure, and how do they think it's important, what way should we be measuring projects and programs that affect Aboriginal people? So what I've got so far is that if it's not healing, what's the point? So the men in the Aboriginal corporation are very cognizant now of the trauma that they're suffering, and also the trauma that they're passing down to their children because of them being stolen as children. And it's led to a whole lot of many different types of trauma, including intergenerational trauma. So they're saying if the project or program isn't healing in some way, then what's the point? They're also saying if it doesn't interrupt the intergenerational trauma, then it's wasting money. So I felt that these were two really early but really important findings to come to the table with today. And it's just so different from the things we normally measure in evaluation. We measure how many people showed up. We measure, did it finish on time? Did we measure, did it work within the budget that we had for it? And all those sorts of things. But for this group of people, they're saying it's got to be healing, and it's got to interrupt intergenerational trauma. You might think that that's
2 minutes left.
Thank you, Katie. You might think that's a really hard thing to measure, but what I also did is I asked those three groups of people, how would we measure that? And they came up with some really amazing ways. For instance, the staff said, at the moment we get lots of crisis calls. If this program works, then we could measure the number of crisis calls before the training and then measure the number of crisis calls after. And if it's working, we'll know that we'll be getting less crisis calls and more calls asking for help early on in a situation. And I thought that was a really great way of measuring, quantitative as well. So that's my research so far. I hope I've made it easy to understand. I think going forward, it's really critical that Indigenous people lead evaluation so that we're looking through an Indigenous lens and undertaking the evaluation with Indigenous worldview on projects and programs that affect them. So thank you everybody for listening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And that was fantastic, Nicole. And I'm not sure why my video isn't working. I'm very sorry. It was working before, but nonetheless. Nicole, just see if we've got any questions. Okay, we don't seem to have any questions in the chat. So would anyone like to Oh, there you go. I had to press the right button. Would anyone like to ask a question? I have a question for you, but let's see if someone else would like to ask a question.
I've got a question.
Okay, Shay. Yeah.
First of all, I just want to say congratulations. It's such unbelievably important work, and I just want to congratulate you on taking up such an undertaking. And even with the few statistics that you did share with us, it's very shocking to hear that huge amounts of money are being spent and it's just not being grounded in the proper needs of the people and proper evaluation.
Thanks, Shay.
So I'm really, really, really inspired by what you're doing. So I want to ask you about how this year has influenced your process, whether that's changed things for you, because that's something that's topical for all of us, and also ask you a very big question about your dreams for where your project will go, and what you want to do with it eventually, like your really big dreams, which I always like to hear.
Thanks, Shay. The first question, what was the first question? I was so focusing on the second one there.
Well, you can answer the second one first, but I was asking you how the challenges of COVID have influenced things for you. And
okay, I was really lucky in that I collected all my data just before, so at the end of last year, just before the World Health Organization called it an international crisis. So I've been happily bunkered down in my home office, listening to recordings and writing up my data. So I've been very lucky there. I still keep in contact with the men, obviously, and the staff and the descendants, and we do all of that via Zoom. So I think it's easy when you have a relationship, it's easier to keep up that relationship on a virtual platform than trying to start new relationships and build new relationships. So I was very lucky there. My big dream is all of my research is happening just at the same time that the government has built a body to look after evaluation of Indigenous projects and programs specifically. And they're in this process of just gathering input from the community about how they should do that. So I feel like my dream's already something that's happening, but I really hope that in the future, we can see a lot more funding going to projects that are proven to work in the community in the way that we look at projects, not necessarily in the way that government or other funding bodies consider what success is. So, and I think we will get there. I think it's an evolutionary thing, and I think we're privileging Indigenous knowledge is now more than ever before. So I'm really hopeful about that. And maybe my little 2 cents worth will be just a little key in there in the process.
Thank you, Nicole. And I tell you, it's not 2 cents worth. It's more than that, because it's very important research that you're doing. And for myself, I think it's absolutely fabulous. And I've just learnt so much listening to you, and I'm sure everyone else has, because we don't realise what research is being done, but also what is not and why it's not. And I have a question for you, that why do you think only 10% are evaluated?
I don't think generally most things are evaluated or have been evaluated well. I think it's something in the last 10 to 15 years we've really started placing importance on. And I think we've just been at the bottom of the list when, you know, that revolution has happened. I think also the fact that Closing the Gap has hit a refresh. Now government departments are looking outside of the box and going, okay, what else are we getting wrong here? So yeah, I think, yeah, probably they're the main reasons.
Okay. And Jane has a question for you.
Hi, Nicole, thanks. That was great. And it's really important work that you're doing. And I'm just curious about if you think that Indigenous ways of doing like things like evaluation, but other ways, do you think there's a time when we can actually have Indigenous perspectives leading the way as opposed to catching up. Like, it would be really, I think, a refreshing way for the whole of society to be taking the lead, to be following the lead from Indigenous perspectives and ways of doing things differently.
I just love that question, Jane. And wouldn't it be great? Because I think there are lots of concepts and values in collective knowledges that would benefit everybody. I do think there's a long way to go. A lot of power has to be given up, and we are in a colonized country. And I think where we do have colonized countries and marginalized peoples, we have a power imbalance. And giving up the power is something that power imbalance is built into every structure, in every government, every policy, and every practice. So maybe it will happen in little spots here and there, but in general, I don't see that happening for a couple of lifetimes.
I asked because I read it. I can't remember what the book is, but I've started a book and it's talking about exactly that issue. So I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but maybe I'll text it to you later.
Is it Younger Porter's Sand Talk?
Yes, yes.
Ah, there you are.
Yeah.
Yeah, great book.
I'm finding it very inspirational.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Thanks, Jane.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. And Tobias, you're next.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I just can't see anything. But congratulations, Nicole. I just want to second the importance of your work, and really good on you for taking that on. And my question is in response to what your participants said about if it's not healing, then it's not a good program. And I was just wondering if your research, or I might have missed it at the beginning, I came in a bit late, but if the lit review or your current state of the research reveals some of the characteristics that would make those programs healing programs, if there's anything coming out of the participants or from the things you looked at that identifies a few areas that are healing instead of revisiting the trauma.
There's a lot of research in closely related areas like lived experience, work with lived experience people, peer or survivor-led programs. There's a lot of research in there about how to work in a healing way and what constitutes healing. But in the world of evaluation, we still haven't really tapped into that, not that I could find. And it's a really fast changing space. So my lit review is constantly having to be updated, which I guess that's the same for everybody. But I still haven't found, I feel like I've just stumbled over this, it's got to be healing. And I'm thinking, how can no one else have said this before? Because it's actually a really obvious thing. But again, it's through an Indigenous perspective, because if you're the one that has a wound that hasn't healed, you're the one thinking about healing. So I haven't found anything else yet. Please send it to me if you find it. But in lots of neighboring topics, definitely there's a lot of talk about healing. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Good luck with it all.
Thanks, Tobias.
And thank you, Tobias. And Jane, you would like to ask a question?
I just wanted to respond to that little topic because I think it links in really nicely with a lot of the trauma-informed approaches to education, to mental health, that is very current at the moment. And I think everything is intrinsically linked, and it's not a surprise that these are things that we're learning more about and talking more about. And you found this in your research. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me as a psychologist that these are that we're really talking about healing a lot, because we're getting a better understanding of the impact of trauma on our brains and on cultures. And yeah.
In my other life, I actually teach culturally safe trauma-informed practice. So it is something we're talking about a lot, and we're actually moving past now talking about trauma-informed, and we're moving into talking about healing-informed trauma-aware. So putting that more positive, strength-based terminology onto what we're looking at.
Yeah, great stuff.
Right. Well, thank you,